Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Indian Genes. Our guest today is someone that we have been all waiting to talk to. I have been definitely, and there have been a lot of requests from many of you that have asked for something to do with the paranormal that had to be discussed. And to be honest, I held back for some time. I wanted to speak to somebody who was going to offer us a scientific way of looking at this, at the same time, a logical way of approaching all that we've been hearing about, all that we've been experiencing, and at the same time, somebody who has the empathy to look at this whole phenomenon with an open mind. Our guest today is the head of the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit in the Psychology Department at Goldsmiths, University of London. I am going to stop there for his introduction, and I'm going to let him do most of the talking because I don't think any of you want me to keep talking. But as we say, our guest, a big welcome and thank you so much to Professor Chris French. So, Professor, it's an absolute pleasure. Welcome from all of us here in India, and thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me on.
Before we start, in fact, we will be talking a lot about what you do. We will introduce our audience to. I know you have a very interesting book that's out recently. I love the title. I'll leave that for a little bit later. But before we get to what you do, Professor, if you can tell us, with all the experience that you've had over all these years, is the why. Why do you do what you do, and what actually got you to doing what you do? What is the why behind what you actually do?
I suppose the why behind what I actually do is that, like lots of people, I just find paranormal claims and other kind of related weird stuff just fascinating. Now, in terms of my own personal history, I used to be a believer up until well into early adulthood. I was a believer in lots of various paranormal phenomena. And then I read one particular book called Parapsychology, Science or Magic. And that was the first skeptical treatment of any of this stuff that I'd ever come across. And not only did I enjoy the book, but I actually found the arguments and the evidence presented persuasive. And that's what turned me into a skeptic. So although I'm still fascinated by paranormal type phenomena, or ostensibly paranormal phenomena, I'm now approaching it more from the point of view of, well, can we explain those kind of strange experiences that people have in terms of psychology rather than in terms of paranormal phenomena?
Right. And also, I think with your new book, which I want to start with currently, and I'll let you explain a little bit more about the book to everybody who's listening and what got you wanting to get this book out.
I'd wanted to write a popular science book on anomalistic psychology for a very long time. I realized recently that I'd actually first of all written a proposal for this book back in 2010, but my day job just kept getting in the way. I simply couldn't find the time to actually kind of move forward with it. I mean, the reason I wanted to do that is because I think anomalistic psychology, I should explain what that is because many people won't have even come across the term. Anomalistic psychology is primarily focused on trying to come up with, and wherever possible test, these non-paranormal explanations for ostensibly paranormal experiences. So there's no doubt at all that people often sincerely believe that they've had an encounter with a ghost or a demon, or that they've had a dream that's foretold the future, and so on and so forth. Can we explain those kinds of experiences in terms of human psychology? Can we, wherever possible, try to put our non-paranormal explanations to the test? So typically we're interested in things like the unreliability of eyewitness testimony, the existence of false memories, hallucinations. In other words, all of the ways that our own minds can trick us, can deceive us in such a way that we misperceive, we misinterpret, we misremember. And in some cases, we may end up in a situation where we think the only possible explanation for some experience we've had is a paranormal one, but maybe there are alternatives. And that's really what the book is about. And I think my hope was that by producing a popular science book on anomalistic psychology, we can give some kind of insights about that. We can show the ways in which those kind of cognitive factors influence the way our minds work, and sometimes lead us to, as I said before, misinterpret, misperceive, misremember what's going on around us.
Great. And how did you get through the publishers? It's an amazing name, and I'll let you tell us that story.
Okay, yeah, I was the name of the book. Hope this won't shock any of your listeners. The name of the book is The Science of Weird Shit. The subtitle is Why Our Minds Conjure the Paranormal. It started off as a joke. I mean, I was originally going to call the book Why Weird Stuff Matters, and I still think that's quite a nice title, because one of the things about this kind of area is that although many people kind of find it fascinating, it's the kind of thing that people talk about over dinner or when they're having a drink in a bar. You know, we've all got some, whether we're believers or skeptics, we've all got something to say on this kind of topic. But usually it's not treated as being a very serious subject. Now, actually, I think that's a mistake. I mean, for a whole host of reasons. One is that these kinds of weird experiences are much more common than is generally realized. Two is that if any of these paranormal claims actually are genuinely paranormal, and by that I mean they're beyond explanation in terms of conventional scientific concepts, well, that would be an amazing discovery. I mean, it would mean that our current scientific worldview is, if not actually mistaken, at least it's missing some really important elements. And so that would be really, really important. And then there are other aspects that come into it, the kind of consumer protection angle. That if you go to see a psychic or a medium and you're paying them for their services, I think you're entitled to know whether they can really do what they say they can do, and so on. I mean, the list goes on in terms of why I think that these are important questions. I mean, either at the end of the day, paranormal forces really do exist, and that would be an amazing scientific breakthrough, as I said. But if they don't, trying to understand what's happening when people report those kind of experiences is giving us an insight into the way the human mind works. So either way, it's worth taking them seriously. But so why weird stuff matters. That was what I was going to call the book, for all of those reasons. And then just to one or two friends, I said, or I might just call it The Science of Weird Shit. And I was saying it as a joke just to get a laugh, but almost without exception, people said, oh, I'd buy that. And so eventually I began to think, well, maybe I could call it that. And I didn't know whether or not the publishers would be willing to. But yeah, it's MIT Press. It's a very respectable publisher. And yeah, they were up for it. They were all for it. In fact, in my head, I always had the title with a little asterisk where the I was in the final word of the main title, SH asterisk T. But no, they insisted, no, we'll just go straight for it. We'll say it as it is. So yeah, they were quite happy with it. A friend of mine who is a quite successful writer in his own right said, when I told him what the book was called, he said, well, you'll sell 1,000 just on the basis of that title alone. So that's what we went with.
Right. And I also guess it's when it comes to book titles, if the content is what actually is so powerful, because I've read your book. So I think once you get past the title, yes, like you said, that could be the first clickbait title, but probably that's what the publishers wanted to go with as well, because after you read the content, you then understand the depth of that book. And
Yeah.
what I've also noticed is, or what I wanted to bring up here was about the timing of this book, because there are good books and there are many good books. However, there are some books that come out at the right time because people seem to be either needing it more than wanting it, or it has to be put out there at a particular time. Now, is there anything to do with what we are going through currently? And I would talk about the last 7, 8, 9, 10 years with all the changes everywhere around the world. Is the timing important for you as well?
It's an interesting one because I mean, I've been involved in, if you like, in kind of skepticism. As I say, and I read the book that turned me into a skeptic. I read in the early 1980s, and that was not long after a group called, at the time referred to as CSICOP, the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, was set up in the mid 1970s, and that group was set up in America by a group of kind of thinkers who were very worried about what they saw as a kind of rising tide of irrationalism. It included people like James Randi, Paul Kurtz, Martin Gardner, Isaac Asimov, some really, really big names. And so I suppose that the irony here is that although for, I think, a lot of people, this idea of fake news is a relatively recent concept, it's been around, well, it's been around forever, absolutely, for centuries, but certainly even back in the 1970s, people who would kind of self-identify as skeptics were aware of this fake news, this a lot of ideas that were around at the time. A lot of them would be the kind of New Age movement ideas, belief in complementary and alternative therapies, claims about aliens and psychics and all that kind of stuff, which they would see and I would see as kind of being basically fake news. It's not backed up by any kind of strong evidence. So fast forward, as I say, I originally wrote the proposal in 2010. What has happened is that we are all now much more aware of these kinds of issues. So fake news is nothing new, but public awareness of fake news, I think, is a big thing now. Whereas skeptics, scientists, we do care about the truth. We want ideally to be able to counter that misinformation and disinformation that swamps social media, because it's having, it has really important deleterious knock-on effects. I mean, the obvious examples would be belief in unfounded conspiracy theories, such as the anti-vax movement. That costs lives. And you can point to lots of other examples of where these kinds of ideas have a really important, very, very damaging effect on people's lives, on the quality of life, and so on and so forth. So I think we do need to do what we can. It's not an easy task. There are no easy answers, but we need to try and do what we can to improve critical thinking skills and to counter the prevalence of misinformation and disinformation, and to try to alert people as to how they can try and find the difference. I mean, we can all be taken in by misinformation and disinformation, but I think if you kind of are aware of, first of all, its existence, and secondly, the kind of techniques that are used by these people to try and trick us and pull us in, we might be able to protect ourselves from it a little bit more effectively.
So, Chris, you mentioned interestingly about critical thinking, and very few of us have actually been taught how to think right. And if we look back at the scientific method, which I think is, you're talking about the last 300 and 400 years, prior to that, it was more verbal, it was more written the way it was written. And an important aspect of this is the ability to replicate a particular phenomenon. And I think that's a very important point when we talk about any phenomenon, whether it's paranormal, whether it's scientific. Are we able to replicate it under certain circumstances that clears all doubt? And that, I think, is something that probably you would want to touch on. Or how important do you think that, but that's like a gate, right? Because I can say I have a lot of abilities and powers and fine, but can I do it at will, or can I predict when it will happen?
Right. I mean, there are a couple of chapters in the book about the tests that we've carried out of paranormal claims for a couple of decades now, a few decades. And what we typically find there is that people who put themselves forward for testing, people who say that they have some kind of psychic ability. I mean, the standard example would be someone who maybe is a professional psychic. They give people psychic readings for a living. That's how they make their money. And I would say that the vast majority of them genuinely believe what they're saying. There are fakes out there. In the book, tongue in cheek, I refer to, I think it's French's second law, that the higher the profile of the psychic or medium, the more likely it is that they use deliberately fraudulent techniques. But I think your average workaday psychic or medium probably doesn't. They're probably fooling themselves as much as they're fooling anybody else. They genuinely believe they've got a gift. And sometimes they will put themselves forward to be tested. We've carried out lots of those tests over the years. And what typically happens is we design a test in collaboration with the person making the claim. and we get them to sign something in advance to say it's a fair test of their claim. And then when we run the test and they don't pass the test, they then decide actually that retrospectively they think it wasn't a fair test after all. And that's the kind of standard pattern that repeats itself over and over again. So on the one hand, you've got those kinds of situations. Then with respect to the question of replicability, that is the issue of, in terms of more kind of experimental investigations of various claims. So if you look at parapsychology, parapsychology now has been going for well over a century, and still there isn't a single phenomenon that you can kind of replicate, that you or I could set up an experiment to see whether this particular phenomenon can be demonstrated and stand a reasonable chance that it would be. Now, it's not only parapsychology that has problems with replicability. We've recently become aware of the fact that psychology also has some problems in this area. And what we've seen, which I think has been a very healthy thing, is that psychology has been trying to improve, has been trying to get its house in order. And so there are all kinds of factors that were at play here. A lot of even the standard, what we thought were standard psychological effects, which had been kind of talked about in standard textbooks for many, many years, we now realize that a lot of those were probably not genuine effects in the first place, because attempts to replicate them just don't. So how did they come about? How was it that they came about in the first place? It was probably not, in general, the result of deliberate fraud by the people running the studies and writing them up, although that does happen, but it's probably fairly rare. What it was probably down to, we would now recognize as being the use of what have become known as questionable research practices. So as I say, that's not out and out fraud. It's not making up the data or deliberately altering the data in order to fool people. It's just, in any kind of experiment that you carry out, there are various decision points where you could either do it this way or you could do it that way, with respect to kind of running the study, analyzing the data, and so on and so forth. And if you don't actually specify exactly in advance how you are going to do each and every one of those, how you're going to handle each and every one of those decision points, you can try it one way, and then if that doesn't get you the result that you want, you can try it another way. So to give you an example, supposing I design an experiment where maybe with a project student, and we intend to run 1,000 participants through this particular experiment, but we're running out of time. The deadline for the project student is approaching. They need to kind of stop and get their project written up. And we look at the results when we're up to 60, say, and we find we've actually got the effect we wanted. Well, I would probably then, in the olden days, I'd have been tempted to just stop and think, well, fine, we've got the result we wanted. We can write it up now, and maybe we'll get it published in a journal. If we'd got a result that was just not quite statistically significant, I might then have been tempted to kind of collect the rest, get up to 100, collect the data some other way, and then analyze it again and see whether we'd managed to get that significant result. Now, it doesn't sound like the biggest crime in the world, and indeed it isn't, but you're giving yourself 2 bites of the cherry. And there are so many of those kinds of decisions that you have to make that it allows for such flexibility that it's often the case that you're going to come up with results that look as if they're significant, as if they're revealing a true effect, but in fact they're not. It's because of all this flexibility you had in terms of the analysis of how you analyze the data. So we're all much more aware of that now. I mean, another bias that's in science generally, and certainly in psychology, is that up until recently, journals were not prepared to publish negative findings. That means that all the results that you see published in the journals are not representative of the field as a whole. Because for most people, if you ran an experiment and you got negative findings, you wouldn't even try to get it published because you knew that the editors wouldn't be interested. So all that data was just gathering dust in file drawers. and what was being published was not representative. It was typically it was novel findings, it was positive, significant results, but which may not be at all representative of the field as a whole. So we're becoming much more aware of those things, and that's kind of crucial, because replication and indeed transparency, allowing people to look at your data so that they can analyze it, they can look to see whether there's anything odd about it. That's something that's really coming into fashion now, which I think is a good thing.
Chris, and mentioning about this data that you were talking about because of the various tests that go out. Now, probably that's one of the reasons as well that when we talk about paranormal activity or the whole topic, what actually gets bunched into this particular label? Because there are events, you can talk about conspiracy theories, or you can talk about the uh, affiliation for conspiracy theories, whether you are part of it or you just enjoy it. The second thing, or one part of it, could also be, as you've said, things to do with aliens and abductions. Those are activities and phenomenons that get picked up socially, and we hear a lot about. But is there a broader definition? And you would probably be the right person. If it was not these popular topics, what would you bunch and what would you say this is paranormal activity? Because one is the activity because you're seeing it or you're witnessing it, but the other one is internal. You have a you tend to move towards this. You may not be an observer, you may not even be an experiencer, but it's something that you enjoy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we're endlessly fascinated by ostensibly paranormal phenomena. In terms of how you define the paranormal, it basically depends who you ask. If you were to ask a parapsychologist, parapsychologists are people who try to use the scientific method to test the idea that maybe paranormal phenomena really do exist. So they'll see if they can produce good evidence for the existence of things like telepathy, or telepathy being kind of direct mind-to-mind contact, or precognition, the alleged ability to be able to sense future events before they take place, or clairvoyance, the alleged ability to pick up information from remote locations without using the known sensory channels, and also psychokinesis, the idea that you can influence the outside world just purely by the power of your mind. All of those kind of things. Basically, parapsychologists would tend to limit their area of interest to, on the one hand, ESP, extrasensory perception, and that breaks down into telepathy, precognition, and clairvoyance. Also, psychokinesis, and also evidence relating to life after death, or the possibility of life after death. And that would be it for them. Whereas the mass media and anomalistic psychologists tend to have a much wider, looser definition of pretty much kind of anything weird and wonderful. Now, I think there's a good reason for that, insofar as I would argue that the underlying psychology is often very similar. That the processes, the psychological mechanisms are often very similar in different areas. So, for example, if you go to see a medium or a psychic and they give you a reading, if it's a medium, then they're claiming that they are contacting the spirits of dead people. So therefore, it's within the definition of parapsychology, because it relates to the possibility of life after death. They'll tell you things about your life, or they'll claim they're telling you things about your life and about your future and about your past and so on and so forth. If you go to see an astrologer, the reading that they give you will essentially be very similar. But they don't claim that they're talking to the spirits of the dead. They say they're picking up this information from looking at your horoscope chart. Now, I would say that the underlying psychology in both cases is likely to be very, very similar. And so I wouldn't want to limit myself to just looking at the psychology of mediumship, when we can also learn something valuable by looking at the psychology of people accepting or rejecting astrological readings. And there are lots of other areas like that. I mean, you take false memories, for example. There's a lot of psychology looking at how susceptible we are to false memories. And that's relevant in with respect to some paranormal topics, like the idea of past life memories, I would say a lot of those are down to false memories. But it's also relevant in other areas of outside that. So the same techniques are used when people are trying to apparently recover memories of being abducted by aliens. But strictly speaking, aliens, UFOs, and so on, that's not within the strict definition of the paranormal. So at the end of the day, it depends who you ask. And I don't think, I don't think any of us have kind of got any kind of God-given right to say, well, this is how it must be defined. As long as we make it clear what we mean by these terms when we're using them, then I think that's appropriate.
Right. And you did mention probably people who could look at you, tell you your future, tell you your past. There are also alien abduction stories, but all this probably could start from a place where I was reading an article that you had published about the associations between sleep variables
Mm-hmm.
and the impact it could have. So, when you spoke about that, or in that article specifically, could you give us a little bit of insight into why you think, and I know you've done a lot of work on sleep and why that has an impact? We can probably come to dreams and what you spoke about that later.
Sure.
But how do we put sleep into this picture to understand how it sinks in?
Well, one of the really important sleep-related topics that we've done a lot of research into is the phenomenon of sleep paralysis, which in its most basic form is a fairly common experience. It's when you're between sleep and wakefulness, either just going into sleep or just coming out of sleep. And in its most basic form, it's just a temporary period of paralysis. And if that's all you experience, then it's a little bit odd. It's a little bit disconcerting, but it's not really anything to get too worried about. However, it can be associated with other symptoms that can make it absolutely terrifying, and they typically include things like feeling a very strong sense of presence. You feel as if there is someone or something in the room with you, and they have malign intentions towards you. They don't mean you any good at all. But you may actually also hallucinate. You may hear voices or footsteps or mechanical sounds, or you may see lights moving around the room or dark shadows or monstrous figures, demons, witches, old hags, anything that your imagination can dream up, you can experience during an episode of sleep paralysis. You may feel as if you're being held. You may feel that there's something breathing on the back of your neck. And bear in mind, throughout all this, you can't move. You can open your eyes. Your eyes are one of the few parts of your body that you can move. And you can see that you're in your bedroom. It does not feel like a dream. It feels incredibly real. And so it's understandable that if you already have a belief in ghosts, demons, or whatever, that you may well interpret that kind of an experience in those terms. Now, the link with alien abduction claims is a little bit different insofar as typically people don't. I mean, it can happen, as I say, anything that you can imagine you can crop up during an episode of sleep paralysis, but typically people don't see little grey aliens when they're having these experiences. However, if you have been having repeated episodes of sleep paralysis, then you may well come to the conclusion, if you don't know that there is a scientific and medical literature on this phenomenon, you may well come to the conclusion that either something strange and paranormal is really happening to you, or that you're going crazy, to put it bluntly. Now the thing is, it's neither of those. It's this thing called sleep paralysis. And if you then were to see a TV program or read a magazine article or a book by some UFO expert, there's a lot of people within the world of ufology who believe that when the aliens abduct you, they are able to wipe your memory of most of the experience. However, they claim, there might be a few telltale signs, such as, for example, have you ever woken up in the night and you were unable to move? And there was a strong sense of presence. and you could see lights or dark shadows moving. In other words, what they are doing is they're describing the symptoms of sleep paralysis, but they see it as evidence that you've been abducted by an alien. Now, if this is the first explanation for the weird experiences that you've been having that you come across, well, firstly, it gives you an explanation. It reassures you that you're not going crazy, but it does seem to suggest to you that you really maybe have been abducted by aliens, but they have somehow managed to wipe your memory. So the next step is to try to recover those memories. So you might go to see somebody who can carry out hypnotic regression. There's lots of people think that you can use hypnosis to uncover hidden or repressed memories. Now, the truth is that what happens when you go through this process is you get lots of imagery going through your mind, and it corresponds pretty much to what you expected before you went in. If you go for hypnotic regression, expecting to uncover memories of being abducted by aliens, there's a good chance that you might end up with those memories, but they're false memories. And the same goes if you went into that situation expecting to uncover memories of having been Cleopatra in a past life. You end up very often with what you expected to end up with, but they are false memories.
Right. And in all your years of research and looking through all these experiences or incidents, has there been any incident that you think is unique that has stuck with you, or we are still looking for an explanation for that particular incident? Is there something that stands out for you?
I mean, people often say, I do lots of public talks, and one of the kind of questions I'm most commonly asked is, have you ever come across something that you couldn't explain? And what I usually do in those situations is just to say, no, next question. But I'm only joking when I say that, I mean, I then kind of explain that, no, really, I don't claim that I can explain every single claim that's ever been put in front of me. That would be, it'll be silly. Most of the time, I'm not. I wasn't actually there when the events happened. People are talking about something that they say happened to them, and so it's very difficult for So I can't kind of say, oh well, I know that couldn't possibly have happened. I wasn't there. I don't know. But I do know that eyewitness testimony can be very unreliable, and I can kind of present evidence to show that. I can talk about studies that we've done under properly controlled conditions where we can
Or the
show that
or
people.
or,
Sorry, go
or
on.
the gorilla in the room?
Exactly. There's all kinds of. I mean, there's the famous experiment often referred to as the invisible gorilla. People miss things that they are sure they would not miss. In that particular study by Simons and Chabris, they showed people a video clip of two groups of people, some with black t-shirts, some with white t-shirts, throwing a ball back into each other, and you had to count the number of times the people in the white shirts threw the ball to each other. Ignore the people in the black shirts. And while that's happening, halfway through, someone in a gorilla suit walks through the middle of the group, stands there beating their chest, and then walks off. And it turns out that people who are doing the counting task, about half of them don't see the gorilla. Now, that is so counterintuitive. You're sure that something so odd is bound to attract your attention, but it doesn't. So, maybe when people kind of report these completely inexplicable paranormal phenomena that they've experienced, maybe there was some ordinary explanation, but they just didn't notice what that explanation was at the time. And if you don't encode it at the time, then it's not there in memory to recover. There's nothing you can do about that. So, yeah, I think we can kind of, having said all that, going back to your original question, there have been one or two, there's never been anything in terms of the kind of experimental investigations of paranormal claims that I've carried out, or that my students have carried out, my PhD students or my undergraduate students, that's ever really challenged my skepticism. There have been one or two things. I've taken part in various kind of TV programs and documentaries over the years and so on. And there have been one or two of those that have certainly intrigued me, where at the end of it, sometimes I come out of those situations thinking, oh, I'm pretty sure I know what's going on there and it's not paranormal. Sometimes I come out of there thinking, well, I don't think it was paranormal, but it was certainly intriguing. I'll give you just one example. There aren't that many, but I say there are one or two. There was a program I took part in called The Man Who Paints the Future. And this was about an old chap who was an artist, and he believed that his dreams foretold future events. So what he would do, he would get up in the morning, he would wake up in the morning and try and get a clear image in his mind of what he'd been dreaming about. And then he'd get up and he'd either paint a picture or draw a picture, maybe write a few notes on it, and then basically put it to one side because he didn't know when the events were going to take place. So that made it very hard to directly test his claims. But what we could do, I mean, the obvious counter explanation was that the correspondence between his dreams and various events might just be a coincidence. I mean, basically, the aftermath of one earthquake is much the same as the aftermath of another earthquake. So if you dream about an earthquake, there are earthquakes happening all around the world every day. So what we tried to do was to see if we could look through the news archives and find what we felt were either matches to news events that were either as good as or better than the ones that he'd come up with. Now, in general, overall, we then asked independent judges to rate what, give each one a rating in terms of the degree to which they felt it matched his painting. And overall, the events that he'd chosen did slightly better, but statistically significantly better than the ones that we'd chosen. Having said that, he was giving us his best examples from over kind of, several decades. And we just had a week or two to try and find better examples. And in some cases, we did manage it. But yeah, that one, I would say, I count that as a score draw. I came away intrigued by what was going on there. This guy had two dreams about the Twin Towers collapsing. One of them was a couple of months before it happened. The other one was 5 years before it happened. But interestingly, it was 5 years to the day, which was quite spooky. But again, could have just been a coincidence.
In fact, interesting. I was just listening to an interview by Uri Geller just yesterday, and he was talking about all his claims, the famous spoon bending and everything that happens. Well, he was known as the spoon bender, finally the spoon bender, but I don't think he was ever able to replicate that under controlled experiment or circumstances. But how do you look at these claims, whether it comes to remote viewing and countries are still involved in that, people are still doing it, and more importantly, what do you think about the claims by Uri Geller?
Okay, well, with respect to the remote viewing stuff, again, I'd say that the evidence base there is not strong enough to convince the wider scientific community. I mean, you're quite right that there was quite a lot of coverage several years ago when it was revealed that it was called the Stargate Project. It was revealed that the American government had poured, I think it's about $20 million into investigating these claims of remote viewing. And essentially, remote viewing is a situation where you have a receiver, the remote viewer, who there are different ways of doing it. Two standard ways, I suppose. One is where you have another person at a remote location. It could be anywhere. It could be a library. It could be a park. It could be an airport. It could be anywhere. And that person who is at the distant location tries to transmit images and information back to the receiver, and they just describe what's going through their mind. It's all recorded and so on. You can make drawings if you want to, or a similar procedure, but you don't have a sender at a remote location. You just say, give map coordinates and say to the remote viewer, tell us what's at this location. Now, as I say, $20 million sounds like an awful lot of money, and for most people it would be. But in terms of the American defense budget, it is the tiniest of drops in the ocean. And, somebody somewhere along the line had thought this was something that was worth just checking out. They were very clever when they got reviews done of this whole project, because they got two people to review the evidence. One was a woman called Jessica Utz, who is a statistician who is known to be very sympathetic towards paranormal claims. And the other was Ray Hyman, who is known to be a very skeptical psychologist. And so they ended up with two reports that came to different conclusions. And then basically they could do whatever they wanted, either carry on funding the project or pull the plug on it. And it's interesting that they chose to pull the plug on it. Now, they wouldn't have done that if they'd have thought there was any chance at all that the Russians would gain some kind of an advantage by carrying on, doing this kind of research. They clearly just thought it wasn't worth it. And I think that speaks volumes. So again, I'm all in favor of people carrying on doing this kind of research, but they need to produce evidence that's strong enough to convince the wider scientific community that there really is something going on there, something that needs to be explained and can potentially be exploited.
Right.
When it comes to, sorry, Uri Geller, I'll just talk about Uri Geller first, because when I was still at school when Uri Geller first appeared on the scene in the UK, and I was totally taken in by him. I was so excited. I thought he was the real thing. And there were scientists who were saying that they thought he was the real thing as well. So I remember it being a really exciting time. I mean, as you say, he claimed that he could bend spoons just by gently stroking them, but he also claimed that he could read minds. He could tell you what were in the contents of sealed envelopes, a lot of other stuff like that. And now it wasn't until kind of many years later that there are a couple of very good books on Uri Geller, one by the late James Randi, and one by David Marks and Richard Kamen, called The Psychology of the Psychic. And they pretty much kind of explain how Geller achieves his effects. I mean, I have now got lots of friends who are conjurers, and they can do the spoon bending thing, and they say, that if they do it as a trick, they say it's a trick. It doesn't involve anything paranormal at all. And if Geller is doing it using psychic powers, he's doing it the hard way, because it looks exactly the same when you do it as a trick. And as you said, Geller was never able to demonstrate that particular claim under properly controlled conditions.
Right. And I guess these days, what is now being talked about, and you had spoken about this earlier about UFO abductions, but more interestingly, the UFO sightings that have come up recently with the Tic Tac video. And so these are people that currently we have who are at reputable positions within the Navy, who have witnessed these events. They've recorded it. Of course, the recordings are not clear. How do you approach this when you talk about there's a balance here now? Because we were speaking about sleep deprivation, we were speaking about probably past lives and regression. But here you now have people who are trained, and I do know that a particular training doesn't mean that eyewitness testimony from you would be any different from anybody else, because that is eyewitness testimony at the end of the day. But we do have video now, and
we do.
when you see
Yeah.
all this news coming out, how do you take this?
Again, I mean, with respect particularly to kind of some of the videos from the US Navy, the Tic Tac video and so on, got lots and lots of coverage. I personally don't think I've necessarily got the kind of appropriate expertise to be able to give you an alternative explanation of those videos. But certainly, I've seen there's a chap called Mick West who does understand about things like camera artifacts, about the effects of kind of parallax and so on and so forth. And I've seen him giving explanations for what he thinks is happening with respect to those videos. And I kind of find it convincing. You may say, oh, well, that's because I'm a skeptic and I don't want to believe, but I find it convincing. With respect to a lot of the other evidence that is being claimed at these Senate hearings and what have you, it's all hearsay. I mean, at the end of the day, all I'm saying is, show us the actual evidence. If you say that the American government has recovered alien bodies, show us, just show us. And then that's it, game over. The skeptics have lost, the believers have won. Show us the crashed flying saucers. It's incredible to me that there was so much attention paid to people standing there saying, well, I've spoken to a man who says that he's seen this. That's not evidence, that's hearsay. So no, I was totally unimpressed by those hearings. And I was amazed that so many people seemed to think that this was some amazing breakthrough. We're always being promised these amazing breakthroughs in the field of ufology, and to some extent in parapsychology. There's always the dawn is just around the corner, and it never seems to arrive. If it arrives, that'd be amazing. I'd be so excited, and it's an empirical question. If I had to bet on it, I would bet there is intelligent life out there. I don't know there is. None of us know whether there is or not, but I would think, it's a big place, probably is. But again, I mean, it's nobody knows. But it amazed me that those kind of hearings got so much coverage.
Mm.
And at the end of the day, just show us the evidence. Just show us. That's all it takes.
And it's interesting you say, or you speak about if there's intelligence life out there. With sometimes what I see around, my question is there intelligent life down here? But that's a different topic, right?
Yeah.
And so we are not sure of that as yet. But having said that, with this particular topic that you're covering with paranormal activity, now we do have different personality types, and if you get into psychology, we do know that there are the 5 main personality types. But I'll just restrict it down to probably. For the ease of this conversation, you have the introvert, you have the extrovert, you have somebody who's more conscientious, you have somebody who's come from a different cultural background. Have you noticed that certain people, that is with a particular personality type or disposition, tend to move towards more or are taken in more by, for example, conspiracy theories, or won't settle down for what's available out there with proof, but there is always something to be found or something hidden that has to come out there?
Yeah, it's interesting with respect to conspiracy theories that up until, I think it's probably fair to say, certainly 15, 20 years ago, there was hardly any research on the topic of the psychology of belief in conspiracies. One or two little papers here and there, but very little. And now it's a huge area. And I think that's partly goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that we're all much more aware now of the dangers of misinformation and disinformation and belief in incredible conspiracy theories and so on and so forth. So it's become a hot topic, and so there's a lot of research into lots of different aspects of what is it that makes conspiracy theories particularly attractive to some people. And again, just to get this out of the way, we're not saying that conspiracies never take place. Yes, of course they do, but the point is that some people find conspiracy theories particularly attractive, to the extent that you and I could make up a conspiracy now on the basis of no evidence whatsoever. And if we included it in a questionnaire or a survey, along with other more famous conspiracy theories like the JFK assassination, faked moon landings, etc., we would get a percentage of people, probably a relatively small percentage, but a percentage of people who say, yeah, I believe that, just because it's a conspiracy, So what is it about these people? Well, as I say, people have looked at kind of various personality factors. That's been kind of quite interesting, but not revealed too much. You find that people, one personality dimension that people sometimes talk about is in terms of whether or not you have an internal or an external locus of control. And basically what that means is we all have a particular disposition along a continuum. For some people, they view their situation in life, it's basically down to their own decisions, their own actions. They are people with an internal locus of control, and that's generally seen as being the kind of healthier end of this continuum. There are other people who believe that things just happen to them that are beyond their control. There are forces out there that are leading them to have the life that they have. Often kind of people who feel that they're victims of these other forces. And obviously that's the relatively unhealthy end. I mean, in fact, of course, it's a mix. Some of the stuff that happens, you are in control of. Some of it just happens out of the blue. But it's this disposition that we have in terms of how we think about our own lives. And surprise, surprise, you find that people who believe in conspiracies tend to have an external locus of control. They think there are forces out there that are beyond their control that are affecting their lives. And there are other personality dimensions that people have looked at as well. But I think that there's also another approach to looking at this kind of psychology in terms of cognitive biases. And again, there's some interesting findings there. For example, we all have what's called an intentionality bias. When something happens in the world around us, we tend to have as a default that someone or something made it happen, and that someone or something has intentions towards us. Now, excuse me, most of the time we then kind of just, we kind of dismiss that. But you can see how that kind of general attitude would lead you to thinking that everything that happens in the world is planned, there's nothing accidental, and therefore when there's a COVID outbreak, for example, well, somebody made that happen rather than it just being some fluky event. Whether it be something that happened on a food market in China, or whether it was an escape from a lab or whatever, but there was no great kind of plot behind it to try to wipe out the world's population. It was just something that just happened. But as I say, this intentionality bias would tend towards conspiratorial thinking. I mean, one of the reasons we're so successful as a species is that we're very good at picking up on patterns and seeing meaning and significance in what's going on in the world around us. But sometimes we overplay it and we join the dots when really they shouldn't be joined. And again, that's another factor that will lead towards conspiratorial type thinking. And again, a lot of the factors that relate to conspiracy thinking also relate to paranormal beliefs, including the ones I've just mentioned. So these things are all interrelated. These biases that we probably have because in terms of our evolutionary history, it usually was better to assume that there was something there, like a potential threat, something kind of in the bushes that might suddenly jump out and eat us, assume it was there and take appropriate evasive action rather than missing something. Two kind of errors we can make. One is to think something's there when it isn't, or the other one is to think that something isn't there when it is. And the latter is usually more costly. So we've evolved brains that have a bias towards making what scientists would call a type 1 error of thinking there is something there when there isn't. And so, again, I think that's a kind of plausible explanation for why we have these cognitive biases. But they can affect us in all kinds of ways, and we just need to be aware of them. We can't eliminate them, even if we're aware of them. We all suffer from them. But maybe the believers in conspiracy theories and the paranormal tend to suffer from them a little bit more strongly than those who don't endorse those beliefs.
Right. And earlier you spoke about memory as either a false memory or an important aspect of people. You also spoke about the internal locus of control. Now, that ties in obviously with a person who talks about either free will or determinism, because if there is free will and if I know that I have free will, I am going to move towards actions that I can take control for or off. However, if you're talking about something that's deterministic, then I would tend to anyway think that it's all in the stars, it's all there, it's going to happen anyways. And does this tie into what you were just speaking about as well?
Well, I mean, that whole question of whether or not we have free will is one that philosophers have wrestled with for centuries, as I'm sure you're aware. And so I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I'm predisposed to thinking that we don't have free will, but we have the illusion of free will. We live our lives as if free will existed. I mean, without free will, we don't have things like, we can't hold people responsible for crimes that there's no justification for punishing them because they couldn't have done anything else. But when you get right down to the kind of atomic and molecular and subatomic level, I find it hard to believe that there's something that means that the molecules and atoms and subatomic particles that make up our brains can somehow defy the laws of physics and give us free will. And if they can't, then everything's predetermined because it's all in accordance with the laws of physics. And so, logically and kind of intellectually, I end up at a position of thinking, well, I don't think free will can exist. Then again, if free will doesn't exist, all this stream of words coming out of my mouth now, we're all predetermined. So what's to say, how can we decide whether they're true or not? You get into all kinds of, what's the word? paradoxical situations. Yeah.
Circular reasoning.
I find it fascinating to kind of sit and think about these things, but I don't know what the answers are on those big questions. I mean, the whole nature of the mind-body problem, which is obviously relevant here. I don't think we've solved that one yet, despite what some people may claim. And it's kind of interesting that within parapsychology, there are certain areas of research which would have huge implications for that very question. I mean, clearly, anything that relates to the possibility of evidence for life after death would imply some kind of radical dualism. If something of you survives when your physical body is no longer here, then that does imply that mind can become separated from the body. And so when people are talking about things like out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, reincarnation, even ghosts, that does imply some kind of radical form of dualism. And most neuroscientists, I think, would tend to reject that and say that consciousness is entirely dependent upon what's happening in the physical substrate of the brain. And I would tend to be more sympathetic to that position as well. But as I say, there are some areas of parapsychological research which could have profound implications for those questions.
It's called near-death experiences, and then we talk about what happens post-death. So it's not that. We don't have somebody who's died and then come back. Otherwise it would have been called post-death experiences, right? So the fact that it's a near-death experience, you're still not dead. There's a 2-3%, I guess. So why not call it death experiences or post-death experiences? And I'm sure there's a reason for these claims I think about. Now, coming back to what you were talking about as far as all these events that are happening at the moment, Chris, do you see over the last 10 years that for some reason, or do you even think that there is a reason that this is spoken about so much more now? And earlier, it probably was not mainstream, but what I can see over the last few years is there are a lot of activities, there are a lot of topics that were considered fringe are now being considered as mainstream or moving into mainstream. And it was interesting, you mentioned earlier when papers were being published in probably the older days, you had to go through rigorous uh, tests. You had to, but today we talk about the process more than the outcome or more than executing it. And so you do have papers that are being put out, and people need to, for example, prove more than what has just been written on paper. Why is this happening today? Why do we see that there is suddenly, or was this always happening, and is it because now we have social media and everybody like me is a podcaster, so I can put out my own content and then it just gets published?
I think that has a huge role to play. It's very, most of what all of us believe about the way the world is, the way the universe is not based on direct personal experience. It's based on what we've been told by other people that we know and trust. And so therefore it boils down to, what are those other information sources and how trustworthy are they? And what we've got now is a situation where, as you say, any kind of podcaster or influencer can put ideas out there that haven't necessarily gone through any kind of rigorous peer review, and not necessarily based on any kind of good evidence, but have a certain truthiness. They sound plausible, they sound true, they maybe sound very positive and life affirming and so on and so forth. But they're not necessarily true, and we've almost got to the point. People talk about, are we living in a post-truth world where truth doesn't even matter anymore? Yeah, for all my interest in the area, I am still at a loss to explain certain aspects of human psychology.
Is there something that is in the can now and there's no more discussion? That behaviorism at one time was the trend, but now we hear it's not. And we have these waves, and with every new generation or with every new technology today, and we'll come to technology or AI in some time, but is there something that we've done, we are clear, and we say, okay, we've got this covered?
I think we've made it. I think we need to be, it's a balance between, on the one hand, recognizing that we have made progress in various areas in terms of understanding things, how neurons work, the underlying basis for various psychological disorders and so on. We have made real progress. A friend of mine used to always say, the more we know, the more we know we don't know. And I think that is the kind of situation there, that we have learned a lot. We've made real progress in a number of different areas, both at the kind of neuronal level and at the kind of higher level of psychological factors. But there is also still a huge amount to uncover. Particularly, as I say, I made a reference before to the mind-body problem. I mean, the philosophers call it the hard problem. And I think that is an area where we're still a long way from even knowing what the shape of an answer would be, to understanding how it is that we have subjective experience, and yet we also believe that we're built of atoms and molecules, and the same way that other things in the universe is, and yet we have subjective experience, we have consciousness. How can that be? How can that work? And I just don't think we know. So there's still huge challenges ahead. And AI, you've referred to a few times, the kind of rapid advancements of AI in recent years, which are throwing up all kinds of issues and potential dilemmas that we've yet to get our heads around.
Interestingly, while you were talking about aliens and abductions, and obviously that's a topic I just want to get a little bit from you about. But what I want to know from you is, what is your belief? Do you think that two parts to this question? One is, do you think that we are the only life in the universe? That's one. Is there a possibility for life out there? And second is, have we been visited? Are we being visited? And those are the two important questions that I had for you.
Well, on question one, I don't know. If I had to bet, I would bet that there probably is intelligent life out there. Just on the basis of, the famous Drake's equation. Frank Drake came up with this equation to try to estimate what were the chances of intelligent life in our own galaxy, the Milky Way. And it's got various kinds of terms in the equation. How many stars are in the Milky Way, how many of those stars have habitable planets, and so on and so forth. And on that basis, with the kind of best guesstimates that we can come up with, I would say it looks quite likely that there may well be intelligent life out there. Why have we never heard from any of them? And that's the famous Fermi paradox, and we can speculate about why that may be. There's all kinds of possibilities on that front as well. But yeah, I think there may well be intelligent life out there, but as I say, I don't know. With respect, what was the second part of the question? Sorry, whether we've been visited in the past. Well, I'm not convinced on that front. I mean, that was
have we been visited?
Yeah, in the past. Yeah, so the kind of ancient astronauts idea. When I was a teenager, I was really, really taken with the writings of Eric von Daniken. I thought they were fabulous and totally swallowed it all, believed it all. And now I'm very much aware of the fact that what he was presenting as evidence was really very, very poor quality, including kind of sometimes just making stuff up. So I'm not convinced at all on that front. I think that there's almost an element of racism, I think, in some of that the idea that these primitive people, the Egyptians, couldn't possibly have made these huge pyramids. It has to be some kind of advanced alien civilization with amazing technology. Well, no, not true. They were very intelligent people, and they could organize things and they could get it done. And I think that there is a kind of almost a kind of a smack of racism about that whole attitude, that these were primitive people who couldn't have done this stuff. And so, no, I'm not at all convinced that we've ever been visited by aliens. But again, I could be wrong. I mean, they'll put that on my gravestone out there. He could be wrong. I'm sure that there probably are things that I am wrong about, because one of the things about being a skeptic is that you demand very high quality evidence before you will accept a claim. But it may be that the claim is true, but the high quality evidence just isn't available for various reasons, So I'll probably reject some ideas that turn out to be true, but that's a risk I'm prepared to take.
Mm. And with these activities, do you think that, or is there some thought in your mind that there is a possibility and when I say, I'm not talking about a superpower, I'm just talking about an ability that all of us have, and maybe somewhere in the future we would realize what we could do, a different faculty in their mind or brain that is currently being used or we've used before, and over a period of time it becomes more common, but because it's an anomaly at the moment, nor are they able to explain it, nor are we able to rationalize it. But there is a possibility, do you think, that there are certain individuals who have probably at one end of the spectrum been doing things?
I'm not convinced on that. I mean, basically, as I say, if we could get one person who could demonstrate that they could do these amazing things, I mean, we don't want to fall into the trap of always rejecting every amazing claim that we come across, because it turns out that, take firewalking, for example. You may be tempted, if you're a kind of naive skeptic, to say, oh, I don't believe it exists. Well, it does exist, and it can be explained just in terms of physics. It's nothing paranormal. It's pretty amazing, and it's real. And there are certain phenomena that are like that. There was a chap that James Randi tested, for example, who claimed that he could identify particular LP records of classical music just by looking at the grooves on the plastic. And it turned out he really could do this. Yeah, but he wasn't claiming it was a paranormal ability. He just had a very vast knowledge of classical music. He knew about the kind of the way that record pressing worked and so on, and he had this ability. So don't reject something just because it's amazing. But first off, you have to have a situation where it is demonstrated that people really can do what they claim they can do. And typically when it comes to things like telepathy and psychokinesis and so on, then those reliable demonstrations are just not there, So that would be the first step. And then if we discovered any of these kinds of abilities, we might find that, everybody has them, but they're not aware of having them, and or maybe they don't. Maybe it's just a few gifted individuals. But whatever, I think the first step is to actually demonstrate them. And I'm not convinced that people do have those kinds of abilities. I think, as I say, people vary in terms of things like the degree to which they maybe can control psychophysiological functions that most of us wouldn't have such great control over. And that's amazing and interesting in itself, and we should study it and take it seriously. But when it comes to people claiming that they have paranormal powers, it's just not been demonstrated to my knowledge, to my satisfaction.
What about Edgar Casey?
Well, again, you look at Edgar Casey, and it's always a matter of trying to separate the fact from the fiction, because a lot of claims that are made by his supporters turn out to be not true. A lot of the stuff that he came out with was definitely not true. And at the end of the day, you have to kind of make a judgment as to, did he really have some kind of amazing abilities or not? And overall, as I say, I'm not convinced. It's not a case that I've looked at in detail, I'd have to say. Maybe if I did that, I might be swayed. But on the basis of what I do know, I'm not convinced. As I say, I was taken in by Uri Geller for a while. I wanted him to be the real thing. For a long time, I believed that he was. He wasn't, and that seems to be the case with a lot of these kinds of claims. I mean, the point is, of course, that you could take me to a magic show, and I would not be able to explain how that magician was producing the effects that he or she was producing. But the difference there is that I know there are these kinds of techniques. I know enough about magic. And as I said before, I've got friends who are conjurers. I know enough about magic to know that there are techniques that can be used to fool me. I enjoy watching magic shows. I like being fooled like that. The difference is that those people are not claiming that they've got paranormal abilities. But when you get somebody like Uri Geller coming along saying, well, I know this looks like a magic trick, but I'm using paranormal powers. Yeah, I wanted to believe that at the time. I went
Right.
along with that willingly.
All of us wanted to do. He was the ultimate spoon bender. And if I have that ability and I add a little bit more of uh, ability to probably ask open-ended questions and observe, because people react to certain questions differently, and you already know when people are getting uncomfortable. So what I'm getting asked, all you're doing is you're mirroring what the person wants to tell you subconsciously, and then you're throwing out five options. It seems to be, it's always an algorithm, right? Left or right? Okay, left, and then you keep moving, and that's how the computer has been working with what we're talking about. It's you have algorithms starting from one yes and no, and then you have a tree of decisions called the decision tree that you can get to reality. Do you think that a lot of what is happening or what tends to happen is this, that is deliberate? That's one. And there are some people who genuinely believe in what they are doing.
I certainly believe that most people who claim to have psychic powers genuinely believe that they have. However, when we put them to the test, they typically fail the tests. Now, you know, I think you need to be very cautious when it comes to people talking about kind of non-verbal communication and giving away information without realizing it, because that area itself has been overhyped. There's some valid research there for sure, but basically, we don't have reliable techniques to know, say, for example, when someone is lying or telling the truth. We just don't. There are one or two people who seem to have some kind of uncanny ability in that direction, maybe referring back to what you were saying earlier about, are there some people who have these amazing abilities? But for the vast majority of us, it doesn't work. And there are claims in certain areas like neuro-linguistic programming, for example, that claim that if you look off to in a certain direction, that's an indication of lying, and so on and so forth. And those things don't stand up when they're tested. And so although lots of people buy into them, and there's the whole technique of cold reading, which I suspect you're familiar with. And sometimes I think that skeptics assume that you can tell an awful lot more from non-verbal communication than you actually really can. Cold reading, I would say, is much more about the kind of clever use of language rather than kind of picking up on people's non-verbal communication. The latter can be useful in some of the time, but it's much more about the way you use language. So, for example, I've analysed lots of interactions between psychics and mediums and sitters, and typically the psychics or mediums, they ask an awful lot of questions, which is kind of odd because they're supposed to be telling you stuff, but it's the way they ask the questions that is quite clever. So, for example, if I was trying to pass myself off as a psychic, I actually did this I passed myself off as a psychic on a daytime TV program in the UK, and I claimed that they got me to do a reading for a volunteer. She was told that I was a genuine psychic, and I claimed that I was talking to the spirit of her dearly departed grandfather. And at one point during the reading, I said, was he a tidy man? And she said, oh yeah. I said, yeah, I thought he was. Everything had its place, didn't it? He always used to put things away. Now, it sounded as if I was asking for confirmation of something I already knew. But in actual fact, if she'd have said, oh no, I'd have said, no, I didn't think he was. Never used to put things away, did he? And again, sounds like I'm asking for confirmation of something I already know. But if she answers this way, it's like you were saying with the decision tree, she answers this way, I go off in that direction. She answers this way, I go off in that direction. And it worked like a dream with her, and I've seen other cold readers in action who give me quite stunning performances, even though they're using cold reading. you think, how did they come out with that? But it's one of those skills that the more you practice it, the better you get at it. I'm not particularly good, but I was good enough to pass myself off as a psychic on TV. So maybe there is a future career for me there. But the I don't the idea that just by picking up on these non-verbal cues you can tell. I mean, it depends on the nature of it. Very often, using kind of cold reading techniques, people will remember what you said, what they said. They'll misremember it in such a way that it sounds much more impressive when they're telling their friends about it. So, again, another example from a TV program I took part in, where they sent various volunteers off for different readings with astrologers, tarot card readers, psychics, and so on. And most of them were very impressed with the readings they had. And one young woman was particularly impressed that the psychic had known that her mother's name was Sheila. Now, that's good. That's quite impressive. But of course, when you replay the tape, you realize at no point did he say, your mother's name is Sheila. He came out with lots of different names throughout the reading, most of which meant nothing to her. But at one point said, I'm getting the name Sheila. And she thinks, that's my mum. And then later she's retelling it as, he said my mum's name was Sheila. Well, he didn't. That's just a misremembering, because it's the unreliability of memory. And it's that kind of thing that can be played on, where people can come away thinking that what you said was much more specific and accurate than it actually was. But when you replay the tape, you can kind of get a different insight into it.
We do know about a lot of the psychedelic research that is going on, and it's become mainstream now at the moment. We can probably talk about things like ayahuasca, which is not a controlled hallucination experience, but there are controlled experiments that are currently going on. Now, this is different totally again, and very interesting, because you do not have anybody with you, because you come out of this on your own, and there's nobody to tell you what you witnessed. Now, that's quite interesting, right? Because you're doing your own experience, you're experiencing it, you are the experiencer, at the same time you're the observer, and you're taking part in it, and then you're coming out and trying to make sense of it, which can be quite interesting. But do you think that moving forward, this particular aspect of the unlock that I was talking about probably 25, 30 minutes ago is going to be interesting?
I think, yeah, it's not an area that I have expertise in. I mean, I'm obviously I'm aware of the kind of general research that's going in those kind of areas. I know one or two people who are doing that kind of research, but it's not something I've claimed to be an expert in. My own kind of feeling on it is that there could well be some valuable breakthroughs to come from that kind of research. I saw someone giving a talk recently who was talking about using psychedelics to see if it could help people to kind of make breakthroughs on problems that they were working on, scientific problems. And then the results look quite promising. But as I say, I don't really know enough about it. The idea that, I mean, what seemed to be happening in various studies where they've looked at the effects of psychedelics on the brain is that it seems to kind of increase the interconnectivity between areas which would normally not be so highly interconnected. And so you can see that why that might sometimes lead to kind of breakthroughs in terms of people thinking outside the box, for want of a better phrase, but seeing things from a new perspective that they hadn't ever thought about before. Now, whether or not the experience of psychedelics is revealing some kind of deep truths about the nature of the universe, I just do not know. I know that people feel that that's what's happened. Typically, they can't put into words what that truth is, but they do feel they've experienced it. Now, is that a genuine insight or is it illusory? I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, you could argue that something which disrupts the normal function of the brain is kind of unlikely to be giving you a better insight into the nature of reality. But maybe it is. Maybe it is. I don't know. As I say, it's not my area.
Right. And currently, Chris, what is it that interests you the most? What do you spend most of your time reading or writing or researching? Or there's something that keeps you up at night and you're trying to find a solution to it. What is that one thing that you really want to crack?
It's a very good question. I mean, I suppose I can answer it really in terms of the three main areas that we seem to end up focusing on in terms of the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit were sleep paralysis. I mean, I find that an endlessly fascinating topic. The nature of false memories and the way that they can crop up in different contexts and the implications and what it tells us about how memory works more generally, and the psychology of belief in conspiracy theories. And, I find all three of those areas really, really equally fascinating. Some of them have got more direct real world implications than others. I mean, for example, with my interest in false memories, I do sometimes end up acting as an expert witness in legal cases where there's reasons to believe that allegations of historical child sexual abuse might be based on false memories. I mean, clearly, I'm not going to be in a situation where I always end up arguing that. Quite often I'll come back and say, well, I can't see any particular signs that these allegations are based on false memories. But sometimes there are some kind of big red flags that make you believe that they probably are. Again, it's when you're working as an expert witness, it's not your job to kind of say guilty or not guilty. It's your job just to present what you know about the nature of false memories and how it relates to this particular case for the jury to then decide whether or not they think someone's guilty. But these are kind of important real life implications, obviously, because whatever the outcome of these cases, somebody is going to be devastated. You'll either, if the wrong decision is made, then you're either going to end up with an innocent person being found guilty, or you might end up with an offender going free who shouldn't. So, one way or another, it's got real life implications. It's going to affect people's real lives. So it's serious stuff. But yeah, I'm retired now, actually. So I mean, what I've been doing a lot of lately is kind of promoting my book, and so kind of coming onto podcasts to talk to people like you about my research and about my expertise and my interests. I'm doing lots of conferences. As I say, lots of podcasts and so on. So that's taken up a lot of my time. I'm thinking about whether or not to write another book. I think if I do, it may well be on false memories.
Okay.
In all from
Interesting.
lots of different perspectives. Yeah.
No, we're happy that you're coming on podcast and we're getting a chance to speak to you, just not by reading a book, because there's so much more that has happened over this conversation. And you mentioned three of these aspects. One was false memories, the other one was conspiracies and sleep deprivation. Is there something that we can do about this? Do you have what we say is, for example, conspiracy theories? How do we stay away from that? Or what do we do? What is the advice? Because what is it is an issue. Sleep deprivation, how do you prevent that? And false memories. Is there something that is preventive?
I don't think there is. I don't think there is. Not certainly. I mean, with respect to false memories, I think just recognizing the fact that we all have false memories. I mean, for most of us, the false memories that we have are probably about very trivial things, but we've all got things in our heads that feel like memories, but actually don't correspond to something that really ever happened, or they're a very distorted version of whatever happened. And I think that's an inevitable consequence of the way that memory works. I don't think it usually doesn't have such serious implications as it might do if we're dealing with, say, as I was just talking about, allegations of sexual abuse or satanic abuse and so on. Most of the time it'll be over to kind of trivial stuff that doesn't really matter one way or the other. It's very rare for someone to actually have their memories challenged. The only time it happens is in a kind of forensic context where there's a possibility of some sort of criminal activity, or maybe in get my mouth around this, an anomalistic context. So someone says they've been abducted by aliens, or we want to know whether we want to know what the evidence is, or might this be a false memory? So I don't really see that as something to worry about per se, except, as I say, in those particular contexts. When it comes to things like sleep paralysis, I'm not going to give anybody advice on how to get better quality sleep, because the quality of my own sleep is terrible. I'm kind of I really don't sleep very well at all. And there is a lot of research showing that actually, good quality sleep is quite important for general health. But as I say, I've not really. We can. What I would like to see is more research into trying to examine what are the best strategies for people who suffer from sleep paralysis to, on the one hand, reduce the frequency with which they have those episodes, and secondly, how to cope with an episode of sleep paralysis when it's happening. And there's not been any systematic research into this. We applied several times to try to get funding to do some more systematic research so that we could give people good advice, and we weren't successful. So although there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, a lot of anecdotal advice on websites and so on, it needs to be examined systematically, and that would be something I would like to see happen. When it comes to belief in conspiracy theories, there is a huge amount of research at the moment. I'm not particularly directly involved in the research, but I'm aware that it's happening, looking at the best ways to try and kind of prevent people from falling for misinformation and disinformation, and also how you might go about trying to prevent people kind of going down the rabbit hole of believing in conspiracy theories. There's a lot of research in those kind of areas. I think one of the crucial things here is try to improve critical thinking skills at a much earlier age than we do. I mean, most people never get any kind of training in critical thinking skills. But even those that do, it's usually kind of quite late in life. It's not, I think we need to get in, at school, the age of kids still at school, to try to kind of give them some advice on which websites they can trust, which ones are not trustworthy, and so on. It's not an easy task. I mean, there's no easy solutions here, but I think it's an important task. People are beginning to try and tackle it, though.
And just to check again, which you were talking about another book, so not that I'm trying to get something out from you as a scoop here, but
the one that is, I think, most likely, if I do another book, because it's a huge amount of work, but I did, I found it quite rewarding. I would possibly consider doing one on the topic of false memories, but looking at it from lots of different perspectives. So, there's the basic science of memory and the research on the psychology of false memories. There's also the question of how it relates to various paranormal type phenomena, in particular alien abduction claims, past life memories, the effects of hypnosis on memory, all of that kind of stuff. And a lot of that kind of relates back to the idea of false memories. There's lots of different angles that you could kind of look at the whole phenomenon from, and I think that could make an interesting book.
And Chris, besides what we've just spoken about, what else are you doing? So you actually watch film and movies. What are your hobbies besides cricket?
Well, yeah. Basically, in addition to working, even though I'm retired, I'm still as busy as ever. But in addition to that, I've got kind of various domestic responsibilities. I've got a couple of grandchildren that we look after a couple of days a week, which is always a pleasure, albeit very tiring, but it's great. I love spending time with them. Got a cat and a dog. They take up a lot of my time as well. I mean, I suppose, and we spend probably far too much time watching TV. But we go to the theatre, go to the movies. You know, we have we fill our time up quite happily. You know, so yeah, life's good at the moment for me personally. I'm aware it's not good for lots of people, so I count my blessings in that respect. But you know, I keep busy. I do things that keep me interested, and hopefully other people find some of that stuff interesting too.
And it's something I ask a lot of people I meet and try to figure an answer out from them, because with all these television serials out, with seasons 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, there's a lot of time that you need to invest. So before somebody gives me a good recommendation, then at least you know you're on the right track. So is there any recommendation for people who are listening, or for me, or something that you've watched recently that you found interesting, or could be an interesting watch?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we've enjoyed a lot recently, there's a series called Slow Horses. I don't know if you've heard of it. I think it was on. Ooh, I'm trying to remember which streaming service it's on. I can't remember off the top of my head, but Slow Horses was excellent. We really enjoyed that. People tend to assume that I'll watch a lot of horror movies and
I
paranormal
thought
stuff,
so. So I
but
was
I
expecting
don't.
that.
I don't. I will watch that stuff occasionally, but another thing which I've been involved in a lot lately is there's a podcast series over here called Uncanny, um, which is basically the presenter, a guy called Danny Robbins, interviews people who believe they've had some kind of ghostly encounter, or it may be UFOs, or even Bigfoot, but they've had some kind of paranormal encounter. Um, and they tell the story in their own words, and then he gets a believer expert and a skeptical expert to come in and comment on the case. So I've done a few of those. We also it's been very, very successful, this series, also on BBC Radio 4. It had a kind of TV series spin-off, so there's also now a TV series. And we also did a theatre tour, actually going around and presenting something on stage in theatres up and down the country. So that took up a lot of my time as well. Yeah, I'm kind of keeping busy, doing a lot of stuff that's fun. Yeah, as I say, life's good.
Great. Any plans to visit India, or have you been here? Are you planning
I've
to come
never
here?
been to India. No, I would love to. I would love to kind of get the opportunity to go. Um, I must admit, whenever I go abroad, I always miss my dog. I can't
Right.
wait to get back to my dog and my wife, obviously. but yeah, I've been doing quite a lot of traveling lately because the book came out. I've been invited to various kinds of conferences. Um, I'll be going to Las Vegas in October for a big skeptics conference there. Um, so yeah, it's keeping me busy.
Before we are able to wind this down, I would like to give you some time to tell us about something that you want to pass on as a message, because most of our listeners are college students, and the age group I was last looking at, who actually listens to this podcast, and the age group is between 12 to 23. So about
Mhm.
75 to 80% of these listeners, college students who are probably looking at academics like you, full about who I speak to, because I try to keep it to the academic cycle, and the rest is available on so many other podcasts. And that probably is also a reason why it's not about the volume or the followers, but it's about the content that we are putting out. So there's a responsibility that we have as well with the notable guests that we get on. And to that effect, Chris, I want to first of all thank you for accepting this invitation. I was hoping I could get a chance to speak to you, because this was a topic I wanted to address. I just hope we can speak again, because there's so much more. What would you want to say to everybody before we let you go back to the cat and the dog?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the I suppose. Well, if I've got a message for everybody, I suppose, as somebody who would, I'm class myself as a humanist. I don't believe in God. I'm not a religious person. Having said that, I am happy for people to believe whatever they want to believe, as long as it doesn't have negative impacts on other people. And really, anomalistic psychology for me, a lot of it is about trying to encourage people to think critically, to ask questions, to question the evidence, question everybody. Question your professors, question. Don't take anybody's word for it, but try to apply critical thinking to these kinds of claims. Ask what's the best evidence for them. What's the strengths of the evidence? What's the weakness of the evidence? And make your own mind up. But be tolerant and try and I don't think there's anything to be gained from being kind of hostile and antagonistic to those with whom you disagree. Try to be tolerant, explain your position, listen sympathetically to their position, and basically be nice. Just be nice.
That's a simple message, profound, simple, and in India. We thank you so much for your time and hope we can speak to you again.
Me too. You take care.